Today, we're delving into some authentic history, exploring the many conflicts known as the Indian Wars in America, spanning from 1622 to the late 1870s. In this episode, we'll be examining a fascinating list of 25 significant Indian border wars, as documented in the 1895 book The Creek War of 1813 and 1814 by Henry S. Halbert and Timothy H. Ball. Much of this book has been covered in our series on the Creek War, and this particular list of Indian wars can be found in the book's appendix. Notably, some of these wars are more thoroughly annotated by the authors than others. Today, we'll simply be sharing the list and the author's notes. The book represents a unique collaboration between two authors from opposite sides of the Civil War era. Henry S. Halbert, a Southerner who fought for the Confederacy, and Timothy H. Ball, a Northerner who lived through the war without joining the Union Army. Both men eventually settled in Alabama as school teachers after the war. Interestingly, this section on the Indian Wars was authored by Ball, which may interest some viewers. As the authors acknowledge, this list is likely incomplete, and I'll highlight a few noteworthy omissions afterward. Now, here is the 1895 compilation of the 25 major Indian border wars within the United States. These conflicts trace back to the early European settlements on the Atlantic coast, with the border shifting progressively westward as settlements expanded. Starting with the Virginian Indian War, which began on March 12, 1622 at noon, resulting in the massacre of 350 settlers, and persisting until the Virginia Indian tribes were essentially eradicated. The Pequot War marked a devastating chapter, ultimately leading to the near elimination of the Pequot people. Following this was King Philip's War, a fierce three-year struggle. The Tuscarora War unfolded in North Carolina, ignited similarly to the Virginian conflict with a tragic massacre of settlers. Another brutal period, known as the French and Indian Wars, spurred on by French influence, spanned from 1688 until the American Revolution. This series of conflicts impacted regions like New Hampshire, enduring for nearly 80 years with brief respites. Historian Ramsay noted that New Hampshire was particularly hard hit by these ongoing hostilities. Continuing, the Maryland Indian War commenced in 1642 and stretched over several years. The state later witnessed the Shenandoah Indian War in 1662, further solidifying Maryland's place in these conflicts. The Yamasee War in South Carolina from 1715 to 1718 also began with a violent uprising. The ninth major conflict, the Cherokee Wars, repeatedly erupted in South Carolina between 1755 and 1763, with another significant outbreak in 1776. Another pivotal series of conflicts, referred to as the General French and Indian War, began in 1755. Ramsay observed that these hostilities extended across the western frontier, from New Hampshire to Georgia, lasting from 1690 until the Peace of Paris in 1763. This prolonged period of 73 years, fueled by French influence in the north and Spanish involvement in the south, hampered peace and stifled the growth of the English colonies. Historian Venable adds that these early wars cost the lives of 30,000 colonial soldiers and drained $16 million from the colonies. Number 11 on this list is Pontiac's War of 1763, a significant uprising led by Pontiac, the Ottawa leader, against British settlements. The 12th entry includes several expeditions in 1779 that saw extensive devastation across native lands. In April, Onondaga settlements were targeted, while in August and September, an offensive swept through the Mohawk country, leaving orchards and gardens razed and vast quantities of corn destroyed. During the same months, an expedition from South Carolina ravaged indigenous corn supplies along the frontier, impacting 8 towns and pushing the native populations further back. Additional campaigns in August and September targeted the Mingo, Muncie, and Seneca, devastating 500 acres of corn. 13th is the Cherokee War of 1781, where General Pickens led 394 horsemen to burn 13 Cherokee towns and villages in just 14 days. Next, the 1782 massacre of Moravian towns by settlers, a brutal and unprovoked attack, sparked retaliatory efforts by the Delawares, Wyandots, and other tribes who met settlers aiming to destroy indigenous towns near Sandusky. Number 15, The Kentucky Indian War saw figures like Daniel Boone fighting from 1769 to 1782 in Kentucky's contested lands. The 16th entry brings us to the Shawnee and Miami War from 1790 to 1795. This conflict included significant defeats of Generals Harmar and St. Clair, followed by General Wayne's ultimate victory. Ramsay notes that these intense and repeated conflicts often involved brutal tactics by the indigenous groups, though instances of justice, generosity, and humanity on both sides brought moments of honor amidst a time of violence. In times of captivity, Native American communities often displayed remarkable compassion towards their captives. They would sometimes carry children on their arms and shoulders, share their best provisions, and even forego their own needs to ensure their prisoners did not go hungry. If captives were sick or wounded, they provided care and comfort to aid their recovery. One of the most striking aspects of indigenous customs was their respectful treatment of women. Historical accounts indicate that no woman taken captive was ever subjected to immodest behavior. In fact, testimonies consistently affirm the opposite. This contrast is especially notable, as Ramsay observes in Volume 1, page 289, where he remarks on the unfortunate frequency with which such offenses marred the reputation of those who professed to be more civilized and humane. Similar accounts are echoed by Luzerne Ray in Indian Miscellany, page 292, underscoring that this honorable conduct provided a rare reassurance to female captives amidst their hardships. As Ramsay observes, while captives faced various insults and injuries, there exists no recorded instance of that ultimate violation which is held by female virtue to be worse than death. Moving into the 19th century, we encounter a series of significant conflicts that continued the tumultuous history between native tribes and settlers. Number 17, Tecumseh's War, represents the early conflicts of this century, followed by number 18, the Creek War. The Seminole Wars also commenced in this period, with the First Seminole War marked as number 19, and the Second Seminole War, in which the notable figure Osceola emerged, recorded as number 21. Other conflicts ensued, such as number 22, the Creek War of 1836, and number 23, known as the Indian War or Indian Trouble in Oregon and Washington. The Modoc War of 1872 and 1873 ranks as number 24, followed by the Sioux War of 1876, marking number 25. Additionally, the Cheyenne Raid of 1878 in Kansas and Nebraska, alongside other skirmishes, are not included in this enumeration. These conflicts spanned 150 years of colonial life and a century of American nationhood, with tensions ongoing. The origins of the indigenous people, referred to as the Red Men of the United States, remain shrouded in mystery. Yet, as the conflicts etch themselves into history, the message of their destruction seemed to be ominously inscribed across the land, written in tragic characters of blood. It seems that only divine protection, mercy, and grace within a Christian civilization might save the few remaining fragments of once powerful tribes, offering them a final hope to avoid total extinction in the vast land of their ancestors. So concludes Timothy H. Ball, author of this historical account published back in 1895. While Ball acknowledges that the list is not exhaustive, it does capture many of the major American Indian Wars. One significant omission, however, is the Comanche War in Texas. This conflict began well before Texas joined the United States in 1845 and persisted through the Red River War, finally concluding in June 1875 when Quanah Parker and his group surrendered at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. This conflict, as impactful as it was, stands as a notable chapter in the complex and turbulent history between indigenous tribes and settlers in the United States. The Comanche Wars were particularly intense from the 1820s until Texas became a state in 1845 and then reignited after the Civil War broke out in 1861. Books like Indian Depredations in Texas by J.W. Wilbarda highlight this period, but notably, they contain fewer accounts of attacks between 1845 and 1858. This quieter interval may be attributed to federal troops stationed along the West Texas frontier during those years. Another significant omission from the list is the Sioux Wars, which spanned from 1862 to around 1864. During these years, the Union was stretched thin financially and militarily due to the Civil War, and the Sioux had not received their promised annuities, fueling the conflict. With Minnesota's recent statehood in 1858, this major war seems a necessary addition to the list. Additionally, the prolonged Apache Wars from 1849 until Geronimo's surrender in 1886 marked another critical period in this turbulent history. These omissions highlight a few of the many fierce struggles that shaped the American frontier and underscore the complex, often painful, evolution of U.S. expansion into native lands. It's possible that Timothy Ball chose not to include the Apache Wars in his list because New Mexico and Arizona were still territories rather than states during this period. However, these regions were under U.S. control, and the conflicts had significant effects on nearby states. This raises the question of what other conflicts may be missing from the list. If you have additional insights, feel free to share in the comments. Some wars on this list, such as number 5, the French and Indian Wars beginning in 1688, are mentioned with limited detail. This conflict notably included the capture of Hannah Duston by Abenaki warriors, along with the abduction of Hannah Bradley and her family members. Entries 6 and 7, the Maryland Indian Wars of 1642 and the Shenandoah War of 1692, also occurred in Maryland, though they're less widely documented. In fact, I wasn't able to find much information on the Shenandoah War at all, so any additional details are welcome in the comments. This list, though extensive, leaves room for further historical discovery and discussion. Throughout this episode, the author frequently referenced passages from a book by Ramsay. Although citations were absent, it's likely that these quotes are from David Ramsay's History of the United States, a comprehensive 3-volume work published back in 1816. This channel is dedicated to uncovering historical truths often overlooked by mainstream media. Rather than reality shows, we bring you authentic history directly from original sources and old books that offer a perspective no longer widely presented. Every contribution helps us continue exploring and sharing these historical accounts. So, if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like and subscribe, and join us again for more deep dives into